Could a single day of tactical deception fundamentally break the spirit of the Desert Fox and redefine the entire American military identity? When Erwin Rommel looked across the Tunisian sands on February 14, 1943, he believed he was facing a shattered rabble of retreating amateurs. But he was actually walking into a sophisticated trap meticulously laid by a man who had arrived only 3 weeks prior. George S. Patton had stepped into a disaster and was about to execute a masterclass in psychological warfare that would leave the German high command in a state of absolute disbelief. The North African campaign had reached a point of absolute desperation for the Allied cause by early 1943, as the scorched earth of Tunisia became the ultimate proving ground for American resolve. Following the disastrous engagement at Kasserine Pass, where the United States Army suffered over 6,000 casualties, the morale of the American soldier had plummeted to a dangerous nadir. Equipment lay scattered across the desert floor. Discipline had effectively evaporated into the heat haze. And General Dwight D. Eisenhower issued an assessment that was as chilling as it was blunt, stating that the American soldier had not yet learned to hate his enemy. Into this vacuum of leadership and hope stepped Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a man who arrived in Morocco not as a healer, but as a whirlwind of fire and absolute certainty. Patton understood that the defeat at Kasserine was not a failure of technology or manpower, but a systemic collapse of the warrior spirit that required a radical and immediate surgical intervention. He did not offer comforts or platitudes to the battered men of the Second Corps. Instead, he demanded a level of discipline that bordered on the fanatical, imposing fines for unpolished buttons and requiring neckties in the middle of a desert war zone. This was not mere vanity, but a calculated effort to rebuild the fractured identity of his troops through the imposition of rigid structure and an unyielding expectation of excellence. Patton was convinced that to beat Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, he first had to convince his own men that they were capable of being more than just victims of a German blitzkrieg. While Patton was rebuilding the internal structure of his corps, he was simultaneously obsessing over the psychological profile of his opponent, Erwin Rommel. Patton spent his nights poring over Rommel's own writings and intelligence reports, concluding that the German Field Marshal was predictable in his very unpredictability, and that his greatest weakness was an arrogant tendency to exploit success too far. Rommel's personal diaries from February 10th reveal a profound contempt for American leadership, which he described as cautious and uncoordinated, a sentiment that Patton decided to weaponize against him. Patton initiated Operation Fabrication, a sophisticated campaign of misinformation designed to feed Rommel's existing biases by using easily breakable radio codes in dummy vehicles to simulate a disorganized retreat. The deception was layered with such precision that Patton even staged loud, fake arguments about fuel shortages within earshot of local informants, knowing the information would filter back to German intelligence. He was deliberately painting a portrait of a defeated and demoralized force, inviting Rommel to deliver what the German believed would be the final, killing blow against the American center. Behind this facade of chaos, however, Patton was moving mountains of steel and thousands of men under the cover of absolute darkness and radio silence. He was repositioning 25,000 troops, 400 tanks, and 200 artillery pieces into hidden wadis and strike positions, creating a lethal hammer and anvil with the support of British artillery. On the evening of February 13th, Rommel sat in his command tent and finalized his plans for the annihilation of the American forces at Gafsa, convinced that the desert would do the rest of the work once the initial breakthrough was achieved. He ordered the 21st Panzer Division, a veteran force of 142 operational tanks and 8,000 battle-hardened troops, to strike at dawn on the 14th. Rommel envisioned a classic blitzkrieg maneuver involving rapid penetration and encirclement, fully expecting the American lines to buckle and dissolve under the weight of his veteran armor. He was so confident in the impending victory that he predicted his forces would push the Americans back 200 kilometers by the end of the week, effectively ending the American presence in North Africa. As the sun began to rise on February 14, 1943, the cold Tunisian desert air was filled with the roar of Maybach engines as Rommel's panzers began their advance in 3 disciplined columns. German reconnaissance units had reported exactly what Patton wanted them to see. Gafsa appeared lightly defended, with signs of a hurried evacuation and a lack of organized resistance. Rommel himself traveled with the lead elements, eager to witness the collapse of the American center and the subsequent triumph of German mobile warfare. To the German observers, the vast open terrain looked like an invitation to victory, unaware that every meter of their advance was being watched through the gun sights of hidden American batteries. At precisely 0645 hours, when the German columns reached the exact killing zone Patton had mapped out, the stillness of the desert was shattered by the simultaneous roar of hundreds of American and British artillery pieces. This was not the sporadic, panicked fire Rommel expected from broken units, but a coordinated wall of steel that German radio operators described as a level of devastation never before encountered in the North African theater. Within the first few minutes of the engagement, 23 German tanks were reduced to flaming husks, their veteran crews caught in a crossfire that seemed to come from every direction at once. Despite the carnage, Rommel's initial reaction was one of stubborn disbelief, as he ordered his units to push through what he wrongly perceived as desperation fire. Rommel's fatal misunderstanding of the situation allowed Patton to execute the second phase of his plan with devastating timing and efficiency. At 0715 hours, the American 1st Armored Division emerged from their concealment in the wadis and slammed into the southern flank of the German advance with nearly 400 tanks. This was not a tentative probing action, but a full-speed, coordinated assault that moved with a level of sophistication that shocked even the most experienced German tank commanders. Men who had been defeated and humiliated at Kasserine just weeks earlier were now operating like chess pieces controlled by a single mind, demonstrating a transformation in combat effectiveness that appeared nearly impossible to the observers in the German high command. By 0742 hours, the reality of the situation finally pierced Rommel's confidence, as he realized he was not fighting a retreating rabble, but had walked his elite divisions into a meticulously prepared trap. Intercepted German communications captured the Field Marshal's urgent orders for a defensive formation and an immediate withdrawal. But Patton had already anticipated the retreat. The American 1st Infantry Division moved forward with aggressive precision, cutting off the German escape routes while British artillery created a lethal box from which there was no easy exit. The Panzer units, designed for high-speed mobile warfare in the open desert, found themselves caught in a brutal meat grinder of close-quarters combat that lasted for 8 agonizing hours. The physical toll of the battle was catastrophic for the Axis, with 89 German tanks destroyed or captured, and over 2,000 veteran soldiers becoming casualties in a single afternoon. However, the psychological impact was even more profound, as Rommel's legendary aura of invincibility was shattered in the eyes of his own men and the world. When Rommel finally returned to his command post and received the full casualty reports, he remained silent for nearly an hour, contemplating the magnitude of his miscalculation. He then reached for his personal diary and wrote a sentence that would haunt the German high command. He had underestimated not the equipment of the Americans, but their will and their newfound ability to fight like madmen under a commander who thought 3 moves ahead. Patton, however, was not content with a mere tactical victory on the battlefield and sought to inflict a final psychological blow that would personally terrify the German Field Marshal. Late that night, he authorized an unprecedented nighttime armored raid involving a specially selected force of 200 men in jeeps and light tanks to penetrate the German lines. Their objective was not the capture or death of Rommel, but the destruction of his sense of security by striking his very own headquarters compound. The raid lasted only 17 minutes, but resulted in the capture of staff officers and the destruction of vital communications equipment, leaving Rommel feeling vulnerable in a way he had never experienced in his 2 years of desert warfare. This bold, almost reckless action reinforced the image of Patton as a commander who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, and it deeply unsettled Rommel's state of mind. In a letter to his wife, Rommel confessed that he had finally met his match, describing Patton as a man who fought with a fury that reminded him of his own youth, but with the added advantage of American industrial abundance. The German intelligence files began to swell with reports on Patton's history, noting his service in the First World War and his aggressive theories on armored combat. The Germans had assumed that the bureaucratic American army could not produce such a warrior spirit, and that single day of combat on February 14th proved just how catastrophically wrong they were. The strategic implications of Patton's victory at Gafsa began to ripple across the entire Mediterranean theater, halting Rommel's offensive momentum permanently. The Desert Fox would never again launch a major offensive in North Africa, as his confidence in his ability to predict American behavior was fundamentally broken. In Berlin, the reaction was a mixture of fury and disbelief, with the Wehrmacht High Command demanding an immediate explanation for how the victor of Tobruk could be defeated by untested Americans. Rommel's response was a testament to Patton's impact. The Americans have found their general. This victory provided the American public with its first real hero of the land war and gave General Eisenhower the political capital he needed to maintain the Europe First strategy. The transformation of the Second Corps in just 21 days became a legendary case study in military leadership, proving that the quality of the commander could outweigh years of experience on the part of the enemy. As the Axis forces began their long, slow retreat toward the coast, the shadow of Patton loomed over every tactical decision they made, as they now knew that any mistake would be exploited with violent, calculated precision. The impossible had indeed become inevitable, and the road to the heart of the Third Reich was now being paved by the very men who had once been considered the weak link in the Allied chain. The tactical success of February 14th was not merely a result of Patton's individual fire, but a byproduct of a new, integrated Allied doctrine that the Germans had failed to anticipate. Patton's hammer and anvil strategy relied on a level of inter-service and international cooperation that had previously been absent in the Tunisian campaign. While the American 1st Armored Division acted as the mobile hammer, the British artillery units, which Rommel believed were tied down hundreds of miles away, provided the immovable anvil. This coordination was a direct result of Patton's insistence on absolute radio silence and his willingness to keep even his own superiors, including General Eisenhower, in the dark to prevent any potential intelligence leaks. He knew that the German Abwehr intelligence service was highly efficient, and he treated the secret movements of his 25,000 troops with the same intensity as a high-stakes poker game where one wrong look could reveal the hand. To understand how the American soldier changed so rapidly, one must look at the grueling training regime Patton implemented in the 3 weeks leading up to the battle. He moved through the camps like a relentless force of nature, removing officers who displayed even a hint of hesitation and promoting junior commanders who showed an instinct for aggression. He told his men plainly that the Germans viewed them as cowards, and he used that insult as a whetstone to sharpen their resolve. Private James Crawford, a veteran of the humiliation at Kasserine, noted that the difference wasn't in the rifles they carried or the rations they ate, but in the sudden realization that their commander expected them to win and would accept nothing less. This psychological pivot transformed the Green American units into a force that could execute complex, wave-based tank assaults with a synchronization that Hans von Luck, a veteran German commander, described as being controlled by a single masterful mind. As the battle raged through the afternoon of the 14th, the terrain around Gafsa became a graveyard for the pride of the Africa Corps. The German 21st Panzer Division found itself squeezed into a narrowing corridor where their superior range was nullified by the sheer volume of American fire. Patton had utilized the natural geography of the Tunisian wadis to funnel the German columns into killing zones where every exit was covered by pre-registered artillery fire. The 8 hours of brutal, close-quarters combat that followed was a radical departure from the flowing, gentlemanly war without hate that had characterized earlier desert engagements. American tankers, fueled by a desire to erase the shame of their previous defeats, fought with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal, slamming their M3 Lees and M4 Shermans into the German flanks at full speed. Inside the German command post, the atmosphere shifted from triumphant expectation to a heavy, suffocating realization of defeat. Rommel's chief of staff, General Alfred Gauss, later testified that the field marshal seemed to age a decade in the span of those 8 hours. Rommel had built his career on the Fingerspitzengefühl, the fingertip feeling for the battlefield. But Patton had effectively numbed his senses through deception. When the casualty reports confirmed that nearly 30% of his remaining armored strength had been vaporized in a single day, Rommel's belief in German tactical superiority suffered a blow from which it would never recover. He began to see Patton not just as an opponent, but as a mirror image of himself, a commander who understood that the true battlefield was the mind of the enemy general. While the fighting was a masterclass in aggression, the victory was underpinned by a staggering display of American industrial and logistical might that Patton utilized to its fullest extent. In the aftermath of the battle, American forces captured or destroyed supplies worth over $4 million in 1943 currency, a massive blow to the already strained German supply lines. Patton's ability to move 25,000 men and hundreds of tanks under the cover of night required a logistical precision that the Germans, plagued by fuel shortages and constant Allied air interdiction, simply could not match. This abundance, as Rommel called it in his letters, was now being directed by a man who didn't just have the resources, but the tactical soul to use them as a bludgeon rather than a shield. The news of the defeat hit the German high command in Berlin like a physical shock. General Wilhelm Keitel, usually a sycophant to Hitler's whims, was forced to demand an immediate explanation for how the untried Americans had outfought the veterans of Tobruk. The German military machine had long operated on the assumption that the United States was a decadent nation incapable of producing a warrior class. Patton's victory at Gafsa shattered this racial and professional prejudice in a single day. The reports filtering back to Berlin painted a terrifying picture of a sleeping giant that had not only woken up, but had immediately mastered the art of the blitzkrieg and turned it against its creators. Across the Allied camp, the victory on February 14th changed the hierarchy of command forever. British commanders like Bernard Montgomery, who had previously viewed American military efforts with a mix of pity and frustration, were forced to acknowledge that Patton had achieved the impossible. Montgomery's private letters revealed a begrudging respect for the man who had turned a rabble into a professional army in a mere 3 weeks. For Eisenhower, the victory meant he finally had a combat general he could rely on to spearhead the eventual invasion of Europe. The Patton effect was now a tangible factor in Allied planning, proving that, with the right leadership, the American soldier was the equal of any on the planet. The psychological impact of Patton's midnight raid on Rommel's headquarters cannot be overstated. It was a move of pure psychological theater, designed to show Rommel that he was no longer the hunter, but the prey. By using captured passwords in German-speaking American soldiers, Patton proved that the German lines were porous and that Rommel himself was never truly safe. This forced the Field Marshal to divert precious resources to rear area security and added a layer of personal anxiety to his already deteriorating health. Rommel's diary entries from this period show a man preoccupied with the madness of his opponent, a sign that Patton had successfully moved the war into Rommel's own head. Following the disaster at Gafsa, the Axis position in North Africa became a slow-motion collapse. Rommel's plan to drive the Allies back 200 kilometers was replaced by a desperate fighting retreat toward the Infidabile line. The momentum that had once carried the Africa Corps to the gates of Egypt was gone, replaced by a defensive crouch that allowed the Allies to consolidate their gains and prepare for the final push into Tunis. Patton had not just won a battle, he had broken the mechanical and psychological heart of the German presence in Africa, leading directly to the surrender of over 275,000 Axis troops just months later. Military historians often point to February 14th as the birth of modern American combined arms doctrine. Patton's use of deceptive radio traffic, dummy vehicles, and operation fabrication was a precursor to the massive deceptions that would later make D-Day possible. He demonstrated that in the age of industrial warfare, the smartest commander, not necessarily the one with the most tanks, would emerge victorious. His ability to bait Rommel into an overextension was a classic application of Sun Tzu's principles, proving that Patton was as much a scholar of history as he was a man of action. The soldiers of the Second Corps emerged from the battle with a new identity. They were no longer the boys who had run at Kasserine. They were the men who had beaten the Desert Fox. This collective shift in consciousness was Patton's greatest achievement. He had gifted them a victory that served as a permanent inoculation against fear of the German Wehrmacht. Captain Harry Seuss remarked that they stopped doubting Patton because his predictions had come true with mathematical certainty, but more importantly, they stopped doubting themselves. This confidence would carry these same units through the mountain of Sicily and the hedgerows of Normandy. On March 8, 1943, just before he was ordered to leave Africa for good, Rommel wrote his final assessment of the American force. He noted that 3 weeks of proper leadership had erased a year of defeats, a staggering admission of Patton's influence. He realized that the American ability to learn and adapt was their most dangerous trait. Rommel left the continent a defeated man, carrying with him a profound respect for the cowboy general who had outthought him at every turn. He prayed he would never have to face Patton again, a prayer that would go unanswered during the defense of the Atlantic Wall in 1944. While the victory was total, the cost was measured in the 670 American lives lost or forever changed during that single day of combat. Patton's critics often argued that his aggressive methods were too costly, but Patton himself believed that a cautious war was simply a longer, more murderous one. He chose the path of conquest because he believed it was the most merciful way to end the slaughter. The graveyard at Gafsa stood as a silent testament to the price of rebuilding an army's soul. But the men who survived knew that their sacrifice had turned the tide of the entire war. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, later wrote that February 14th was the day the Germans realized that they had awakened a sleeping giant and given it time to find a leader worthy of its resources. The battle was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, because it proved that American industrial output was now matched by American tactical genius. The template for the destruction of the Nazi regime was forged in the heat of the Tunisian desert, under the watchful, unyielding eyes of George S. Patton. Today, the Battle of Gafsa is remembered as the moment the American army came of age. It was the day two legends of history met, and only one walked away with his reputation intact. Rommel's notes from that day serve as a permanent record of a master being surpassed by his student. Patton's audacity had turned a certain defeat into a legendary victory, proving that, in the chaos of war, the commander who refuses to accept the impossible is the one who ultimately makes history. The Desert Fox had been outfoxed, and the world would never be the same again. If you were in Rommel's position on the morning of February 14th, would you have pushed through the artillery fire? Or was the Desert Fox simply blinded by his own past successes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.